The scent of damp earth and wild thyme hangs heavy over the plains of Pella, where the northern winds sweep down from the rugged mountains of Macedonia to meet the marshes of the Aegean coast. Long before the world knew the name Alexander, this was a land of mist and iron, a kingdom of hardy horsemen, and vast ancient forests that seemed to hold their breath in anticipation of what was to come. The Argead dynasty, which had ruled these lands for centuries, claimed a lineage that stretched back to the hero Heracles himself, weaving a tapestry of myth and reality that defined the very air the people breathed. In this place, the boundaries between the mortal and the divine were thin, like a veil of silk fluttering in a quiet room, and it was into this atmosphere of heavy destiny that a prince was born in the midsummer of the year 356 before the Common Era. His mother, Queen Olympias, was a woman of fierce intellect and deep mystery, a princess from Epirus who surrounded herself with the sacred rites of Dionysus. It is said that the night before her marriage to King Philip was consummated, she dreamed of a great thunderbolt striking her womb, a divine fire that spread across the earth before fading into the darkness. To the young Alexander, these were not merely stories told to amuse a child, but the foundational truths of his existence. He grew up in a court where the rustle of a snake in the grass or the sudden crack of thunder was seen as a message from the gods, and his mother whispered to him that his true father was not the king who sat upon the throne, but Zeus himself, the king of the heavens. This belief took root in the quiet corners of his mind, a seed of ambition that would eventually grow to overshadow the known world. As you settle into your blankets and let the weight of the day drift away, you might find comfort in knowing you are not alone in your search for a peaceful night. Here at the Slumber Archives, we gather every evening to explore the quiet echoes of the past, sharing new history narrations just like this one every single day. If you find these stories help you find your rest, perhaps you might consider subscribing so that we can meet here again tomorrow night. A simple like on this video also helps our community grow, allowing others to find their way to this place of calm. But for now, let the world outside grow dim as we return to the halls of Pella. While King Philip was away at war, consolidating the power of the Macedonian phalanx, the young prince was beginning a different kind of conquest, a conquest of the mind. At the age of 13, his education was entrusted to a man whose thoughts would shape the Western world for 2 millennia, the philosopher Aristotle. In the quiet, shaded groves of Miesa, far from the intrigues of the palace, the master and the student walked together along stone paths lined with nymphs and fountains. Aristotle did not merely teach the boy facts. He opened a window into the nature of the universe, from the movement of the stars to the intricate anatomy of the smallest creatures. But it was the Iliad of Homer that truly captured Alexander's soul. He saw himself reflected in the rage and the glory of Achilles, the hero who chose a short, brilliant life over a long, forgotten one. He slept with a copy of the poem beneath his pillow, alongside a dagger, viewing the text not as a legend, but as a manual for living. It was here that he first truly understood the concept of arete, a Greek word that means more than just excellence or virtue. It is the fulfillment of one's purpose, the reaching of one's highest potential through struggle and will. As the sun set over the Macedonian hills, casting long golden shadows across the academy, the boy would sit and contemplate the vastness of the world, wondering if there would be anything left for him to conquer by the time he reached manhood. As the years passed and the prince grew into a young man of lean muscle and piercing, mismatched eyes, a moment arrived that would become the first great legend of his life. A horse trader from Thessaly brought a magnificent black stallion to the court of King Philip, asking an enormous sum of 13 talents. The beast was massive and wild, rearing and striking at any groom who dared to approach it. The king, frustrated by the animal's temper, ordered it to be taken away, deeming it useless for the cavalry. But Alexander, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, had noticed something the others had missed. He saw that the horse was not angry, but terrified of its own shadow dancing on the dusty ground before it. With a calm that belied his youth, Alexander stepped forward and took the horse by the bridle. He spoke in low, soothing tones, turning the animal's head toward the sun so that its shadow fell behind it, out of sight. The stallion, sensing a spirit that matched its own, grew still. The crowd fell silent as the prince leaped onto the horse's back, and instead of fighting, the animal broke into a gallop, moving as one with its rider across the open fields. He named the horse Bucephalus, or Oxhead, and from that day forward the two were inseparable. It was a symbol of his emerging will, a demonstration that nature could not be broken by force alone, but could be mastered through understanding and a quiet, unshakable confidence. In the cool evening air of the Macedonian palace, one can almost hear the rhythmic hoofbeats of that great horse, carrying a boy toward a destiny that would change the map of the world forever. The rugged landscape of his youth, with its jagged peaks and deep, silent lakes, had forged a spirit that was as unyielding as the iron of his sword. He was a child of the mountains and the myths, a prince who believed the blood of gods ran through his veins, and a student of the greatest mind of his age. As the flickering torchlight in the hallways of Pella begins to dim, and the sounds of the night take over, we leave the young Alexander standing on the precipice of history, unaware that the world he knew was about to become far, far larger than he ever dared to dream. The sharp, metallic scent of spilled wine and the sudden, rhythmic thud of running feet shattered the celebratory air of the theatre at Aegi. It was the summer of 336 before the Common Era, a season of sweltering heat and high political tension. King Philip II, Alexander's father, lay dead on the stone floor, his life extinguished by a bodyguard's blade during his daughter's wedding feast. In that single, breathless moment, the weight of a kingdom shifted. The transition of power was not a slow mourning process, but a lightning strike. Alexander, only 20 years of age, did not hesitate. He stepped into the vacuum left by his father's shadow with a chillingly calm resolve, wrapping himself in the purple cloak of Macedonian royalty before the echoes of the assassin's footsteps had even faded from the courtyard. The corridors of the palace in Pella became a hive of hushed whispers and swift, decisive actions as the young king moved to secure his throne. There were rivals to consider, cousins with claims and generals with ambitions, but Alexander moved through the court like a predator in the tall grass. With the support of the veteran general Antipater and the unwavering loyalty of the royal guards who had watched him grow, he eliminated every shadow of a threat within days. It was a brutal necessity of the age, a clearing of the path so that his vision for the future would remain unobstructed. As he stood before the Macedonian assembly, his voice steady and his gaze piercing, he promised them that though the name of the king had changed, the glory of the kingdom would only expand. But a kingdom is more than just a palace, and the news of Philip's death acted like a spark in a dry forest across the Greek world. To the south, the city-states of Athens and Thebes stirred, believing that a mere boy could never hold the reins of the alliance his father had forged with fire and blood. To the north, the wild tribes of the Thracians and Illyrians saw an opportunity to reclaim their independence. Alexander, however, was not content to wait for the rebellion to reach his gates. He moved with a speed that would become his hallmark, marching his army into the rugged mountains of the north before his enemies even knew he had left the capital. The campaign in the north was a masterclass in psychological and tactical warfare. He crossed the Danube under the cover of night, using hide-filled tents as rafts, a feat that stunned the local tribes into submission. He moved through the mountain passes with the grace of a mountain lion, proving to his men and his foes alike that no terrain was too treacherous for a Macedonian king. Yet, while he was subduing the northern borders, a rumour began to spread like a poisonous mist through the cities of Greece. It was whispered in the marketplaces of Athens and the gymnasiums of Thebes that Alexander had been killed in battle against the barbarians. Thebes, emboldened by this false hope and encouraged by the gold of the Persian Empire, rose in open revolt. They besieged the Macedonian garrison and called for all of Greece to join them in casting off the northern yoke. They did not realize that the boy king was already marching south, covering hundreds of miles in less than 2 weeks. When Alexander appeared before the walls of Thebes, it was as if a ghost had materialized from the dust of the road. He offered them peace, a chance to reconsider, but the Thebans, proud and defiant, refused. The destruction that followed was a somber turning point in history. Thebes, one of the most ancient and storied cities of the Greek world, was leveled to the ground. Its walls were torn down, its buildings burned, and its people sold into slavery. Alexander spared only the temples of the gods and the house of the poet Pindar, a calculated gesture of respect for the arts amidst the ruins of war. The silence that fell over the charred remains of Thebes echoed across the Mediterranean. It was a message written in ash. The young hegemon would not be trifled with. The rest of Greece fell into a stunned, uneasy compliance, and the League of Corinth reaffirmed Alexander as their supreme commander for the coming war against Persia. Before embarking on the greatest journey of his life, Alexander sought a different kind of confirmation, one that transcended the mandates of generals and the treaties of kings. He travelled to the slopes of Mount Parnassus, to the sacred site of Delphi, where the Pythia sat upon her tripod above a chasm of prophetic vapours. He arrived on a day when the oracle was forbidden to speak, a day of ill omen. But Alexander was never one to be governed by the calendar. He sought out the high priestess, and when she refused to enter the temple, he took her by the arm and began to pull her toward the sanctuary. In her frustration and awe, she is said to have cried out, "My son, you are invincible." Alexander released her, satisfied. He needed no further prophecy. Those 4 words became the foundation of his inner world, a divine seal upon the ambitions that burned within him. He left Delphi with a sense of destiny that was almost palpable, a quiet confidence that radiated from him like heat from a hearth. He returned to Macedonia not just as a king, but as a man who believed the gods themselves had cleared his path to the east. The final months on European soil were spent in a state of rhythmic, focused preparation. The heart of his power lay in the Macedonian phalanx, a forest of long ash-wood spears, known as sarissas. These weapons, 18 feet in length, were held by men trained to move as a single impenetrable organism. Alexander spent hours among them, walking through the camps, learning their names, and ensuring that every link in the chain of command was forged of tempered steel. He reorganized the companion cavalry, the elite horsemen who would be the tip of his spear, and integrated the specialized units of archers and slingers that would protect the flanks of his heavy infantry. As the winter of 334 began to thaw, the atmosphere in the port of Sestos was thick with the smell of salt air and the sounds of a civilization preparing to move. Hundreds of ships bobbed in the turquoise waters of the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia. Alexander stood on the shore, watching the endless columns of men and equipment being loaded onto the vessels. He brought with him not just soldiers, but scientists, historians, and geographers. He intended to do more than conquer. He intended to document, to map, and to understand the vast unknown that lay beyond the horizon. In a final act of symbolic shedding, Alexander began to give away his royal lands and revenues to his friends and generals. When one of them, Perdiccas, asked him what he had left for himself, Alexander replied with a single word: hope. It was a staggering gamble. He was leaving behind a kingdom with a nearly empty treasury and a mountain of debt, carrying only enough supplies for 30 days. He was betting everything on the speed of his sword and the favour of the fates. As the first ships began to catch the wind, pulling away from the familiar rugged coastline of Macedonia, Alexander stood at the prow of his flagship. The rhythmic creak of the oars and the splashing of the waves against the hull were the only sounds in the quiet morning air. He looked toward the distant, hazy mountains of Asia Minor, a land of ancient empires and golden cities that had haunted the Greek imagination for centuries. He was no longer the student of Aristotle or the grieving son of Philip. He was the hegemon of the Greeks, the king of the Macedonians, and a wanderer about to step into the pages of eternity. The water of the Hellespont shimmered, a thin blue line between the world he knew and the world he was destined to create. The iron tip of a Macedonian spear bites into the soft, silken earth of the Anatolian shore, a silent declaration of intent that ripples through the morning air. Alexander is the first to leap from his galley, his armour catching the pale light of a sun that has seen 1,000 kings rise and fall, yet none quite like this youth of 22. He does not look back at the receding coastline of Europe, for his gaze is fixed upon the rolling hills of the Troad, where the ghosts of Achilles and Agamemnon seem to whisper through the tall grass. The march begins not with a roar, but with the steady, rhythmic thrum of thousands of sandaled feet striking the earth, a sound like a distant heartbeat echoing across the plains. It is early summer in the year 334 before the Common Era, and the air is heavy with the scent of wild thyme and the salt spray of the sea. The Persian satraps have gathered their forces at the banks of the Granicus river, a narrow but treacherous ribbon of water that stands as the first true gate to the east. They wait on the high eastern bank, their cavalry a glittering wall of bronze and scale, confident that the steep incline and the rushing current will break the Macedonian spirit before a single blade is crossed. As the sun begins to tilt toward the horizon, casting long amber shadows across the riverbed, Alexander's generals urge caution, suggesting they wait for the morning light to reveal the safest path through the water. But Alexander feels the pull of the moment, a physical gravity that demands action. He plunges into the river, his white plumes dancing above the spray, leading his companion cavalry into the churning depths. The water is cold against the horses' flanks, and the stones beneath are slick with algae. Yet the phalanx follows, a forest of 18-foot sarissas tilting forward like the spines of a great silver beast. The clash at the river's edge is a chaotic symphony of shouting men and neighing horses, of bronze striking wood and the wet splash of the current. In the heat of the fray, Alexander is nearly lost, a Persian axe splitting his helmet, but he is saved by Black Cletus, a moment of razor-thin providence that allows the tide to turn. The Persian line, unsettled by the sheer audacity of the uphill charge, begins to fray at the edges, and then, quite suddenly, it breaks. With the victory at the Granicus, the doors to Asia Minor swing wide, and the journey takes on a different, more rhythmic pace. The army moves south along the Ionian coast, where the ancient Greek cities, Sardis, Ephesus, Miletus, wait like jewels strung along the Aegean. To these people, Alexander is not a foreign conqueror, but a liberator, a kinsman returning to restore the old laws and sweep away the shadow of the great king. In Ephesus, he walks through the marble streets, the air cooling as it passes over the stone, and offers to finish the reconstruction of the great temple of Artemis. There is a quiet grace to these days, a sense of homecoming as the Greek world expands to breathe in the air of the East. The soldiers rest in the shade of olive groves, the silver leaves flickering in the breeze, and for a moment the violence of war feels like a fading dream. Yet the path leads ever inward, away from the familiar sea and toward the rugged heart of the Anatolian plateau. By the time winter frost begins to lace the highlands, the army reaches the city of Gordium. In the temple of Zeus there sits an ancient wagon, its yoke fastened with a knot of cornel bark so intricate and dense that no end can be seen. For centuries a prophecy has lingered over this tangle of fibre, that whoever could untie the Gordian knot would become the lord of Asia. Alexander stands before the wagon, the interior of the temple quiet and smelling of old incense and dust. He studies the knot, his fingers tracing the weathered bark, feeling the weight of the impossible task. In a moment of characteristic clarity, or perhaps a refusal to be bound by the rules of others, he draws his sword. The blade flashes in the dim light, a single clean strike that severs the knot and reveals the hidden ends. In the silence that follows, the prophecy seems to settle around him like a cloak, a destiny carved not by patience, but by the strength of will. As the seasons turn and the heat of another summer begins to shimmer over the plains, the scale of the conflict shifts. The great king, Darius III, has finally stirred from his palace in Susa, gathering a host so vast that the dust from their march is said to blot out the sun for miles. The two armies draw toward one another near the town of Issus, where the mountains of Cilicia crowd against the Mediterranean Sea, leaving only a narrow strip of coastal plain. It is a landscape that favors the smaller, more disciplined force, neutralizing the sheer numerical weight of the Persian millions. The Battle of Issus unfolds with a terrifying beauty. On one side, the Persian immortals and the Greek mercenaries in Darius's pay stand in deep, colourful ranks. On the other, the bronze-clad Macedonians, their long spears creating a shimmering, impenetrable thicket. Alexander waits for the perfect moment, his eyes scanning the horizon until he spots the royal chariot of Darius, surrounded by a glittering guard. With a sudden sharp command, he leads a wedge of cavalry directly into the heart of the Persian centre, a lightning strike aimed at the head of the empire. The momentum is irresistible. The air is filled with the metallic tang of blood and the heavy scent of churned earth as the Macedonian horsemen carve a path through the throng. Darius, seeing the young king approaching like a force of nature, finds his courage failing. He turns his chariot and flees into the gathering dusk, leaving behind his army, his treasure, and even his family. The aftermath of Issus is a time of strange, quiet reflection. In the abandoned Persian camp, Alexander finds a world of unimaginable luxury, tents of purple silk, golden wash basins, and the scent of exotic perfumes that linger in the air like a memory. He treats the captured family of Darius with a gentle, unexpected dignity, a gesture that ripples through the ancient world as a sign of his growing maturity. He is no longer just a conqueror. He is beginning to see himself as a successor, a ruler who must bridge the gap between two worlds. The evening after the battle is still, the only sound the distant washing of the waves against the shore and the low murmurs of campfires. Alexander sits in the tent of the great king, surrounded by the finery of a dynasty that has ruled for 200 years. He looks at the golden cups and the intricate tapestries, feeling the immense weight of the crown he is slowly claiming. The road ahead is long, stretching across the burning sands of the Levant and into the mysterious depths of Egypt. But the momentum of the Gordian sword and the victory at the river has set a rhythm that cannot be stopped. The stars above Issus are the same stars that watch over Pella, yet they seem brighter here, more ancient, as if they are welcoming him into a story that was written long before he was born. The air is cool now, a soft breeze carrying the scent of the sea, and the promise of a world that is rapidly changing, one footstep at a time, under the steady march of the Macedonian phalanx. The rhythmic splash of oars against the Mediterranean surf provides a steady, hypnotic pulse as the army moves south, following the rugged coastline toward a city that many believed could never be taken. Tyre sits like a crown upon a rocky island, separated from the mainland by a half-mile of deep, churning blue water, its walls rising directly from the sea as if carved from the very bones of the earth. For 7 long months, the momentum of the Persian campaign slows to a crawl, replaced by the relentless, grinding labor of the siege. Alexander does not simply wait for the city to fall. He commands his men to build a bridge where there was only water. Thousands of soldiers and local laborers carry stones and timber day after day, constructing a massive causeway, a mole, that inches ever closer to the island fortress. You can almost hear the sound of the hammers, the heavy thud of cedar logs being driven into the seabed, and the hissing of the spray against the new stone. The air is thick with the scent of salt and sawdust. As the bridge grows, so does the intensity of the struggle, with the Tyrians launching fire ships and raining arrows down upon the workers. Yet, Alexander remains a constant, steady presence at the front, his eyes fixed on those high walls, his mind already visualizing the moment they will crumble. When the breach finally comes, and the Macedonian ships lashed with siege engines finally touch the stone, the fall of Tyre is not just a military victory. It is a statement to the world that the impossible is merely a task that takes a little more time. With the gateway to the sea firmly in his grasp, the path south opens like a long golden ribbon. The dust of the Levant begins to give way to the cooling shadows of the Nile Delta. As the army crosses into Egypt, the atmosphere shifts from the tension of war to the quiet reverence of a homecoming. The Persians had ruled this land with a heavy hand, but to the Egyptians, Alexander is not a conqueror. He is a liberator, a figure stepped out of ancient prophecy to restore the sacred balance of Ma'at. He enters the city of Memphis, not with fire but with respect, offering sacrifices to the Apis bull and honoring the old gods who have watched over the river for thousands of years. It is during these quiet, reflective days in the cradle of civilization that Alexander looks out at the mouth of the Nile, where the canopic branch meets the sea. He sees a limestone ridge, a narrow strip of land between Lake Mareotis and the Mediterranean, cooled by the northern breezes and bathed in a light so clear it seems to vibrate. Here he traces the outlines of a new city in the sand using handfuls of barley flour, marking where the agoras will sit, where the temples will rise, and where the wide, straight avenues will carry the dreams of a new world. This is Alexandria. Even now, in its infancy, there is a sense of permanence here, a feeling that this place will become a sanctuary for knowledge, a harbour for the ships of every nation, and a lighthouse for the human spirit that will burn long after the men who built it have returned to the earth. But the physical construction of an empire is not enough for a man whose soul is increasingly restless. Somewhere deep in the western desert, nestled among the shifting dunes and the searing heat, lies the Siwa oasis, home to the oracle of Amun. To reach it, Alexander must lead a small group of companions across nearly 300 miles of treacherous, waterless waste. The journey is a meditative trial, a passage through a landscape so vast and silent that the ego begins to dissolve. Legend tells of 2 ravens flying overhead to guide them when the path was lost, and of a sudden, miraculous rain that fell from a cloudless sky to slake their thirst. The desert is a place of visions, where the shimmering heat creates lakes out of air, and where the only sound is the soft whistle of the wind carving the sand into elegant, flowing ribs. When the green palms of Siwa finally emerge like an emerald mirage against the scorched horizon, the air changes. It becomes cool and fragrant, with the scent of dates and fresh spring water. Alexander approaches the temple of Amun alone, leaving his generals behind at the threshold. The temple is a place of heavy stone and deep shadows, where the incense curls in thin blue ribbons toward the ceiling. Inside, the high priest greets him not as a king and not as a Macedonian, but with a title that changes the course of his life forever. "Oh, "Son of Amun," the priest proclaims, welcoming him into the lineage of the gods. We can only imagine the silence that followed those words, the way the flickering torchlight played across Alexander's face as he stood in the heart of the sanctuary. What questions did he ask the oracle in the privacy of that inner sanctum? History does not tell us, but when he finally emerges back into the bright Egyptian sun, he is different. There is a new weight to his gaze, a quiet certainty that transcends mere ambition. He no longer sees himself as simply the son of Philip, the heir to a rugged northern kingdom. He has been claimed by the divine. He is a bridge between the mortal and the eternal, a living God walking among men. This psychological shift begins to ripple through the camp. His friends notice a growing distance, a regal solitude that seems to wrap around him like a cloak. He begins to adopt the subtle trappings of the East, perhaps a purple hem here or a Persian signet ring there, blending the traditions of the lands he has touched into a singular, divine identity. To some of his Macedonian veterans, hardened by years of mountain warfare and simple living, this change is unsettling, a departure from the brotherhood of the phalanx. But to Alexander, it is a necessary evolution. To rule a world of such immense diversity, he believes he must become something more than a man. He must become a symbol that every person, from the shores of the Adriatic to the banks of the Nile, can look upon with awe. As he leaves Egypt behind, heading back toward the heart of the Persian Empire, the landscape of his mind has expanded as much as the borders of his map. The Nile continues to flow behind him, eternal and indifferent to the rise and fall of kings, but its waters have washed away the last vestiges of his youth. The path ahead leads to Gaugamela, to the final confrontation with Darius, and to the very edge of the known world. Yet as he rides, he carries the stillness of the Siwa oasis within him. The stars above the desert are no longer just guides for navigation. They are his kin. The rhythmic clop of his horse's hooves on the dry earth sounds like a heartbeat, steady and sure, marking the progress of a man who is no longer chasing a crown, but fulfilling a destiny written in the foundations of the world. The smell of dust and crushed wild mint hangs heavy in the air of the Mesopotamian plains, a scent that lingers long after the thundering of 250,000 feet has softened into a rhythmic, steady march. It is the autumn of 331 before the Common Era, and the world is holding its breath. Alexander does not rush. He moves with the deliberate grace of a predator who knows the chase is nearing its end. The vast horizon of Gaugamela stretches out before him, a flat, dusty expanse that King Darius has meticulously cleared of every bush and stone, creating a perfect stage for his scythed chariots to tear through the Macedonian lines. But as the morning mist begins to lift, revealing the shimmering gold and bronze of the Persian host, there is no fear in the heart of the young king. He lies in his tent, sleeping so deeply that his generals must eventually wake him, marveling at a man who can find such profound rest on the eve of a battle that will decide the fate of 2 continents. The conflict at Gaugamela is not a mere clash of steel, but a symphony of movement and iron. As the sun climbs high, casting long, dancing shadows across the dirt, Alexander leads his companion cavalry in a daring diagonal charge, a wedge of human and equine muscle aimed directly at the heart of the Persian line. The air is thick with the sound of splintering wood and the low, resonant hum of arrows passing overhead. In the center of the chaos, Alexander catches sight of Darius, standing tall in his high royal chariot, surrounded by his immortals. Their eyes meet across a sea of dust and desperation, and in that moment, the ancient world tilts on its axis. Darius, seeing the inexorable tide of the Macedonian phalanx closing in, turns his horses and flees into the gathering haze of the afternoon. With that turn, the Persian resistance begins to crumble like sun-dried brick. The great king is gone, and the empire he once commanded is now a ghost, drifting away on the wind that sweeps across the plains of Nineveh. As the dust settles and the moon rises over the quieted battlefield, a new era begins to breathe. Alexander does not pause to celebrate with empty vanity. Instead, he turns his gaze toward the south, toward the legendary cities that have served as the pulse of civilization for millennia. The road to Babylon is lined with the silver-green leaves of date palms swaying gently in the river breeze. As the army approaches the city walls, they are met not by spears, but by flowers. The air becomes sweet with the scent of frankincense and rose oil. The citizens of Babylon, weary of distant rule, throw open the bronze gates to welcome the man they now call the king of the 4 quarters of the world. Entering through the Ishtar gate is like walking through a dream made of lapis lazuli and gold. The deep blue glazed bricks shimmer in the sunlight, adorned with relief sculptures of golden lions and dragons that seem to guard the path with a silent, ancient wisdom. The sound of the army's boots on the processional way is softened by the carpets of petals strewn by the inhabitants. Alexander moves slowly, his eyes upturned toward the Itamananki, the great ziggurat that reaches for the heavens, and the fabled hanging gardens that spill over the high terraces like a green waterfall in the desert. In Babylon, he finds a city that matches the scale of his own imagination. He orders the reconstruction of the Temple of Bel and walks the shadowed corridors of the royal palace, marveling at the sheer weight of history that resides within these mud-brick walls. Here the passage of time feels different, slower, more rhythmic, like the steady flow of the Euphrates River that carries the secrets of the ages toward the sea. Yet the siren call of the east continues to pull at him, a soft whisper that cannot be ignored. After a month of rest in the luxury of Babylon, the army moves toward Susa, and then higher into the rugged, snow-capped peaks of the Zagros Mountains. They are heading toward Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid world. This is not a city of commerce like Babylon, but a sanctuary of stone built upon a massive artificial terrace that overlooks the plains of Persia. As they ascend the grand staircases, carved with intricate processions of tribute-bearers from every corner of the known world, the sheer opulence of the sight is staggering. The Apadana, the great audience hall, stands with columns reaching 60 feet into the air, topped with the heads of bulls and griffins that stare out with eternal stony gazes. In Persepolis, the gold is so plentiful that it must be carried away on the backs of thousands of camels and mules. It is a place of quiet, cold beauty where the shadows of the past seem to linger in every doorway. But it is here that a dark shadow falls over the Macedonian triumph. During a night of heavy feasting and wine, as the flickering torchlight plays against the carved limestone walls, a fire is lit. Whether it was a calculated act of revenge for the burning of Athens a century and a half prior, or a momentary lapse of judgment fueled by the heat of the celebration, the result is a tragedy that echoes through the halls of history. The cedar beams of the palaces catch fire, and the flames leap toward the night sky, turning the blue darkness into a roaring orange void. The great hall of Xerxes, the treasury, the private quarters of kings, all are consumed. As the roof collapses and the statues of the kings are charred by the heat, the Achaemenid era comes to a violent, glowing end. The smoke rises into the cold mountain air, a somber signal to the world that the old gods have departed and a new, restless spirit has taken their place. As the embers of Persepolis cool, Alexander feels the weight of what has been lost, but his feet remain set on the path of the hunter. Darius is still alive, a fugitive king wandering the harsh landscapes of Media and Parthia. The pursuit becomes a test of endurance, a long, winding journey through high mountain passes where the air is thin and the nights are biting cold. Alexander pushes his men and his horses to the absolute limit, riding for days with little sleep, driven by a strange, almost melancholic desire to face his rival one last time. He does not seek to execute Darius, but perhaps to reconcile with him, to offer a dignified end to the man whose throne he now occupies. But the betrayal comes from within the Persian ranks. Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, and a kinsman of the king, realizes that the empire is truly gone. In a desperate bid for power and survival, he and his fellow conspirators seize Darius, binding him in chains of gold and dragging him along in a closed wagon as they flee toward the eastern provinces. When Alexander finally catches up to the baggage train, the scene he finds is one of quiet, haunting stillness. The conspirators have fled into the desert, leaving the great king behind, pierced by their javelins. Alexander dismounts and approaches the wagon. There, in the dust of a lonely road near Hekatompilos, lies the last of the Persian kings. Darius is dying, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. It is said that a Macedonian soldier gave him a drink of water from a nearby spring, and that Darius, with his final strength, expressed gratitude that he would not die in total solitude. By the time Alexander reaches his side, the king is gone. The man who once ruled from the Nile to the Indus is now just a body in the dirt, his royal purple robes stained with the red of his own life's blood. Alexander, moved by a profound sense of grief and the vanity of all earthly power, removes his own royal cloak and spreads it over the fallen king. It is a moment of deep, resonant silence, the ending of a story that began centuries before. With the death of Darius, the legal claim to the empire is settled, but the world does not become any smaller. The horizon simply moves further away, beckoning with the promise of unseen lands and rivers that flow into unknown seas. Alexander is no longer just a king of Macedon or a hegemon of Greece. He is the great king, the heir to the east, and the master of a realm that stretches beyond the maps of his childhood. As he prepares to lead his army even further into the rugged heart of Asia, he gazes at the stars that shine with a cold, clear light over the Caspian gates. The journey has changed him. The youth who left Pella is gone, replaced by a man who carries the burdens of an empire on his shoulders and the dreams of a god in his heart. The march continues, the rhythmic sound of footsteps echoing into the vast, waiting silence of the east. The wind in the high passes of the Hindu Kush does not merely blow. It sings a low, mournful song that seems to vibrate within the very marrow of the bone. As Alexander turns his gaze toward the northeast, he is no longer pursuing a single king of kings, but chasing the very horizon itself. The air grows thin and crystalline, smelling of ancient stone and the sharp metallic scent of impending snow. The mountains rise like the jagged teeth of the world, sheer walls of granite and ice that the local tribes call the Paropamisadai. To the Greeks, these are the heights where Prometheus was once chained, a place of myth and cold, terrifying majesty. The crossing of these mountains in the late winter of 329 before the Common Era is an undertaking that defies the limits of human endurance. The soldiers, used to the sun-drenched plains of Macedonia and the warm dust of Mesopotamia, now find themselves wading through drifts of snow that reach their waists. Provisions run dangerously low, and the baggage animals stumble and fall into bottomless crevasses, their cries swallowed by the vast silence of the peaks. Without firewood to cook their meager rations, the men are forced to eat their meat raw, warming it against their bodies as they march. Alexander walks among them, his own face wind-burned and cracked, his purple cloak heavy with frost. He does not lead from a distant tent, but from the front of the line, his footsteps carving the path that thousands will follow. There is a strange, quiet rhythm to this suffering. The rhythmic crunch of boots on frozen crust, the heavy rhythmic breathing of men who have forgotten the meaning of warmth. as they descend into the regions of Bactria and Sogdiana, the lands we now know as Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, the nature of the war shifts like the drifting sands of the Oxus River. This is no longer a world of grand set-piece battles where phalanxes clash on open fields. Instead, it is a war of shadows and ghosts. The local chieftains, led by the relentless Spitamenes, do not seek a decisive engagement. They strike from the hills and vanish into the dust. They poison the wells and burn the crops, retreating into the high mountain fastnesses where the heavy Macedonian armor becomes a burden rather than a defense. For 2 long years, the army is embroiled in a grueling guerrilla campaign that tests Alexander's patience and his humanity. The landscape is dotted with Sogdian rocks, natural fortresses atop sheer cliffs that seem impossible to scale. Yet Alexander's ambition is a gravity of its own. He calls for volunteers, men who have mastered the art of climbing the crags of their homeland, and promises them riches if they can reach the summit. With iron pegs and flaxen ropes, they ascend the frozen rock faces in the dead of night, appearing like white-clad spirits at dawn, to demand the surrender of the astonished defenders. It is during one such siege, at the fortress of the Sogdian rock, that Alexander's eyes fall upon a woman whose beauty is said to have rivaled that of the legendary Helen. Her name is Roxana, the daughter of a local nobleman. In the quiet moments after the surrender, amidst the swirling dust of the high plateau, a marriage is arranged. To some of his generals, this is a strategic necessity, a way to bind the volatile eastern provinces to his crown through blood and kinship. But others see something more, a genuine spark of fascination in Alexander's eyes for this woman of the high mountains. The wedding is a fusion of worlds. Alexander takes a loaf of bread, as is the local custom, and divides it with his sword, sharing the pieces with his bride. It is a moment of profound symbolism, a bridge built between the Mediterranean and the heart of Asia. But beneath the celebratory music and the flickering torches, a cold wind of resentment begins to stir among the Macedonian elite. The men who had followed Alexander from the Hellespont, who had bled for him at Issus and Gaugamela, begin to feel like strangers in their own camp. They watch with growing unease as their king adopts the flowing, embroidered robes of the Persians, and as he surrounds himself with eastern courtiers who bow low in the practice of proskynesis, a form of ritual prostration that the Greeks believe is reserved only for the gods. To a Macedonian soldier, a king is the first among equals, a man you can speak to plainly over a campfire. To see Alexander demanding such subservience feels like a betrayal of their shared heritage. The air in the royal pavilions grows heavy with suspicion and the whispered echoes of conspiracies. This tension reaches a tragic breaking point with the downfall of Philotas, the commander of the elite companion cavalry and the son of Parmenion, Alexander's most trusted senior general. Philotas is a man of immense talent but arrogant bearing, and when a plot against Alexander's life is uncovered, Philotas is accused of knowing of the conspiracy and failing to report it. The trial is a somber affair, held in the heart of the camp under the watchful eyes of the rank and file. The bonds of decades are severed in a single afternoon. Philotas is executed, and in a move that illustrates the cold, calculated necessity of absolute power, Alexander sends a messenger racing across the desert on the swiftest dromedaries to reach Media. There, the elder Parmenion is assassinated before he can even learn of his son's death. It is a dark turning point, a moment where the dream of a brotherhood of warriors begins to dissolve into the lonely reality of an autocrat. Despite the internal shadows, the march does not stop. The army moves deeper into the fringes of the known world, where the rivers run wide and the forests grow thick with trees unknown to the west. The soldiers find themselves in a land of extremes, where the searing heat of the summer plains gives way to torrential rains that turn the earth into a sea of mud. They encounter strange beasts and hear tales of even stranger peoples living beyond the next range of hills. Alexander's curiosity remains insatiable. He collects samples of rare plants and sends descriptions of exotic animals back to his old tutor, Aristotle, even as his boots wear thin and his armor grows scarred by 1,000 skirmishes. As the years in the high country pass, Alexander continues his policy of fusion, encouraging his officers to take Persian wives and incorporating thousands of young Eastern successors into his army. Trained in the Macedonian fashion, he is building something new, a hybrid empire that refuses to be defined by the old boundaries of East and West. He gazes out from the battlements of the many cities he has founded, each one named Alexandria, each one a jewel of Greek architecture dropped into the rugged landscape of the East, and he sees a world that is finally beginning to bend to his will. The mountains of the Hindu Kush are now behind him, their peaks shimmering like white ghosts in the distance. Ahead lies the Indus River and the fabled lands of India, a place of gold and mystery that has haunted the dreams of explorers for centuries. The campfires at night now burn with a different light. The songs sung around them are a tapestry of languages, Greek, Macedonian, Persian, and Bactrian, all drifting upward into the vast indigo sky. The air is still, save for the occasional whinny of a horse or the clatter of a sentry's spear. Alexander sits in the entrance of his tent, the flickering shadows dancing across a map that has no end. He is a king, a conqueror, and to some, a god. But as he listens to the breathing of his sleeping army, he is also a wanderer, forever searching for the place where the earth meets the stars. The journey has taken him to the roof of the world, and yet the horizon remains as distant as ever, a thin, silver line calling him forward into the unknown. The silence of the night is profound, a heavy velvet blanket that covers the ambitions of men and the ruins of empires alike. The scent of rain in the Punjab is unlike anything the Greeks have ever known, a heavy, sweet fragrance of damp earth and crushed jasmine that hangs in the humid air, signaling the arrival of the great monsoons. It is the year 326 before the Common Era, and the world has become a place of shimmering greens and swollen rivers. Alexander stands on the banks of the Hydaspes, watching the turbulent, silt-laden waters rush past, a churning barrier between his weary army and the mysterious heart of India. Across the river, the horizon is broken by a sight that feels more like a dream than reality. The massive, swaying forms of 200 war elephants, their tusks tipped with bronze, standing like grey fortresses against the darkening sky. King Porus, a man said to be nearly 7 feet tall, awaits him there with a dignity that commands even Alexander's respect. The battle that follows is a symphony of chaos and courage, played out in a torrential downpour that turns the earth into a vast, sucking mire. The Greek phalanx, normally so disciplined, finds itself facing a wall of living muscle and bone as the elephants charge, their trumpeting cries piercing the roar of the thunder. It is a slow, grinding struggle, a dance of iron and ivory beneath a sky of slate. Yet, through the mud and the madness, Alexander's tactical genius flickers like a steady flame. He maneuvers his cavalry through the treacherous currents, outflanking the Indian forces until the field is won. When the captured Porus is finally brought before him, bloodied but unbowed, Alexander asks how he wishes to be treated. Porus looks down from his great height and replies simply, "Treat me as a king." Alexander, moved by a nobility that mirrors his own, does more than that. He restores Porus to his throne and expands his borders, turning a fierce enemy into a lifelong friend. But even as the maps are redrawn, a quiet shadows the Greek camp. The victory at the Hydaspes has come at a staggering cost, and the soldiers, many of whom have not seen their homes in 8 long years, are reaching the limits of human endurance. They march onward, deeper into the lush emerald forests, until they reach the banks of the Hyphasis River. Here, the air is thick with rumours of even greater empires to the east, of vast plains populated by thousands more elephants and armies that stretch beyond the horizon. For the first time, the invincible momentum of the Macedonian machine begins to falter. The men sit in their tents, listening to the relentless drumming of the rain on the canvas, and they talk of mothers they have forgotten and wives whose faces are fading like old parchment. Alexander calls for a meeting, his voice filled with the old fire, urging them to push just a little further, to reach the very edge of the world where the great outer ocean surely awaits. But for the first time, his words do not catch the wind. There is a heavy, suffocating silence in the assembly, until Coenus, one of his most trusted generals, speaks for the common soldier. He tells the king that a wise man knows when to stop, that the men are exhausted, their spirits broken by distance and time. Alexander retreats to his tent in a fury, refusing to see anyone for 3 days, hoping his silence will shame them into submission. But the camp remains quiet. There are no cheers, only the sound of the river and the soft weeping of veterans who can go no further. Finally, the King of Kings emerges. He realizes that he can conquer the world, but he cannot conquer the hearts of men who have nothing left to give. With a heavy heart, he orders the construction of 12 massive altars to the gods, marking the furthest point of his journey. The march back begins, not as a retreat, but as a slow, winding procession toward the setting sun. The path home, however, is not a gentle one. Alexander chooses a route south, following the rivers toward the sea, but this path leads them into the maw of the Gedrosian desert. It is a landscape of shifting sands and scorched stone, a place where the sun is a relentless predator and the wind carries the taste of salt and ash. For 60 days, the army struggles through this wasteland. Water becomes more precious than gold. Men barter their finest spoils for a single drop of moisture. Alexander, ever the leader, refuses to drink when his men cannot, famously pouring a helmet of water onto the sand when it is offered to him, showing his troops that he shares their thirst. Thousands perish in the heat, their bones left to be bleached by the sun, a grim trail marking the passage of an empire. It is a harrowing journey that strips away the veneer of divinity, leaving only the raw, aching reality of human frailty. When the survivors finally reach the fertile lands of Carmania, the atmosphere shifts from desperation to a strange, feverish celebration. They have survived the impossible. By the time they reach Susa in the year 324, Alexander is already looking toward the future, obsessed with the idea of a unified world where the distinctions between Greek and Persian, East and West, no longer exist. He envisions a marriage of cultures, a grand blending of traditions that will stabilize his vast, sprawling territories. To symbolize this new era, he organizes the weddings of Susa, a magnificent 5-day festival where he and 80 of his highest-ranking officers take Persian noblewomen as their brides. The city of Susa is transformed into a garden of earthly delights. Silk canopies of purple and gold stretch across the courtyards, and the air is heavy with the scent of frankincense and myrrh. Thousands of guests feast on silver plates, entertained by musicians, dancers, and poets brought from every corner of the known world. Alexander himself marries Statera, the daughter of the fallen Darius, weaving his own bloodline into the ancient dynasty he overthrew. It is a moment of profound symbolism, a king attempting to sew the world together with golden threads of matrimony. 10,000 of his common soldiers follow suit, marrying their Asian companions and receiving dowries from the king as a gesture of goodwill. As the festivities wind down and the torches flicker in the cool night air, Alexander looks out over his empire. He has reached the end of the map and returned. He has faced the monsters of the river and the demons of the desert. He has tried to bridge the gap between continents with rituals and vows. But even here, amidst the music and the wine, there is a lingering sense of unease. The Greek soldiers grumble at the adoption of Persian dress, and the Persians look warily at their new masters. The world is vast, and its wounds are deep. Alexander rests his head, the weight of the crown heavy even in sleep, dreaming of a world that is one, while the stars above Susa continue their slow, indifferent rotation, watching over a king who has run out of worlds to conquer, but whose heart still beats with the restless rhythm of the road. The scent of heavy incense and damp river reeds hangs in the air of Babylon, drifting through the high glazed brick corridors of the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. It is the summer of 323 before the Common Era, and the heat of Mesopotamia is a thick physical presence that settles